Hi, everyone, and welcome to my podcast. Bear with me because this is my first time podcasting, but I hope you have had a great day so far and are ready to learn more about the topics I have planned to discuss. So, to begin, I would like to give a brief synopsis on how I arrived at the theme central to this episode. The text that inspired me to do more research was the book titled Citizen, an American Lyric written by Claudia Rankine. Specifically, in our class, we covered pages 89 to 90 in Chapter 6 of the novel. These pages are a script described as February 26, 2012, in memory of Trayvon, and within them is a heartbreaking dialogue of Rankine's interpretation and response to the disgusting murder of Trayvon Martin. The context that I extracted from this piece was the reference to the prison industrial complex and how it essentially is an extension of slavery, which reiterates the idea that Black folks have never truly been given the reparations they deserve and they are still being abused by systemic power structures. Now, let's get into it. First, Rankine speaks about the everyday experience of Black men and how in America the prison industrial complex impacts their everyday lives inadvertently and directly. Rankine's speaker focuses on the idea of throwing or erasing identity, of how when doing, quote, regular things like waiting, end quote, on page 89, young Black men and boys are consistently represented as criminal and so end up in prison, or worse, as in Martin's case, dead. Rankine's Trayvon Martin script works with different concepts of normativity, specifically regular behaviors, in order to highlight common assumptions about young Black men. For them, traditionally regular activities like hanging on the phone are dangerous and deadly, as is made clear by the verbal link between hanging and lynching within this piece. And that link is represented in this quote, I believe, when it says, "I say goodbye before anyone can hang up. Don't hang up. My brother hangs up, though he is there," on page 90. All these repeated references to hanging up give a routine telephone conversation a sense of murderous foreboding. Now, I think all of this is just a tiny glimpse into what Black folks experience within this country. Despite being regular human beings who deserve to be treated as such, they are often positioned or stereotyped unfairly. And I think that these implicit biases and even microaggressions are a form of imprisonment in and of itself. And Rankine's speaker suggests this too when she adds that the prison is not a place you enter, it is no place, on page 89. And you do not enter it because they've already been entered into it, regardless of behavior. They already have these stereotypes placed upon them. Especially again when she says they have not been to prison, they have been imprisoned, on page 89. This idea and previous ideas are all to the harmful rhetoric spewed against people of color and are amalgamation of historical events highlighted when Rankine describes those years of and before me and my brothers, the years of passage, plantation, migration, of Jim Crow segregation, of poverty, inner cities, profiling, of 1 in 3, 2 jobs, boy, hey boy, on page 89. With this line, Rankine is highlighting that the speaker and her brothers are born into this history, with the lines again undermining the assumption of Black criminality. This understanding of slavery and Jim Crow histories as shared legacies is crucial to the point I am trying to reiterate throughout this podcast. Now that you understand where I derived the concepts from, we will take a brief moment to hear from our sponsors. Just kidding, we do not have sponsors because this podcast does not believe in our information being backed by a larger corporation and influenced by money to brainwash its audiences. Now, back to your regular scheduled programming. In my opinion, intersectionality is at the root of this massive issue. The prison industrial complex is a corrupt entity that would take too long to discuss entirely and quite frankly should be abolished altogether. However, we only have 12 to 16 minutes, so I digress. We are centering our focus on the intersection of slavery and mass incarceration as mentioned in Citizen. The rise in mass incarceration is no coincidence. I feel as if the government likes to create false narratives and act lawful in the face of the public, But make no mistake, they have calculated every single move in order to bolster their credibility and are not afraid to sacrifice the lives of marginalized groups on their journey to maintain power. Their sole purpose is to bolster the white male patriarchy and push a capitalistic system that thrives on the degradation of the working class, which, by no surprise, is largely marginalized communities. They even go as far as to utilize prison labor to aggregate their fast fashion and disguise it as an ethical practice, despite it literally being identical to the concept of slave labor. A lot of our current issues, like some I just mentioned, are a result of current politicians coveting ancient documents that were crafted by white slaveholders themselves. They abuse their power and privilege, and it is blatantly clear that they hide behind the guise of the Constitution. They are utilizing the outdated document as an excuse to undermine and justify the overt prejudice inflicted upon Black folks. And today I am referencing specifically the 13th Amendment, which states, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the parties shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction." This amendment allows for corporations to force imprisoned human beings to work in unimaginably inhumane conditions with no wages. This exploitation is beyond disgusting. Most of all, because most of the inmates have ended up in prison due to factors out of their control. What they did not decide to consider when blindly abiding by this law was that the white founding fathers created this ancient document when slavery existed and when thousands of Americans weren't imprisoned. Currently, the United States has the highest incarceration rate than any other country by a long shot, and Black men are disproportionately impacted. If this isn't clear racism, I don't know what is, to be honest. Yet, there are still so many people trying their absolute hardest to discredit the experiences of these marginalized communities, and it truly baffles me. Anyways, I wanted to touch on this because I recently watched this insightful and brilliant documentary titled 13th, directed by Ava DuVernay. Within this piece, politicians, activists, and scholars analyze the criminalization of Black folks and the prison boom as it connects to the war on drugs and slavery. To give you an idea of what the movie touches on, I would like to provide you with a brief snippet that highlights very thought-provoking points that are made throughout.
We now have more African Americans under criminal supervision than all the slaves back in the 1850s.
Throughout American history, African Americans have repeatedly been controlled through systems of racial and social control that appear to die, but then are reborn in new form tailored to the needs and constraints of the time. After the collapse of slavery, a new system was born, convict leasing. And once convict leasing faded away, a new system was born, a Jim Crow system. And here we are, decades after the collapse of the old Jim Crow, and a new system has been born again in America, a system of mass incarceration that once again strips millions of poor people, overwhelmingly poor people of color, of the very rights supposedly won in the civil rights movement.
If you looked at the history of Black people's various struggles in this country, the connecting themes is the attempt to be understood as full, complicated human beings. We are something other than this visceral image of criminality and menace and threat to which people associate with us.
Okay, so that was the end of the clips that I wanted to include from the documentary. And I know it was kind of long, but the movie was an hour and 40 minutes, so I needed to do it justice to the vast amount of vital information that it gave in that time slot. That was just a brief crumb of what the whole movie educated audiences on, and I highly recommend watching it because I did not even include words from people such as Angela Davis, who spoke in it as well. But now, let's discuss what was gathered. In that excerpt, a woman spoke about how systems of oppression have never really been abolished, but instead they have been repackaged, so to speak, as a different structure. This is proven by the undeniable statistics presented throughout data within the documentary and other sources, like the one I'm about to mention as well, which is in the social justice novel, volume 27, number 3, under the section Slavery in Prison, Understanding the Connections by Kim Gilmore on page 198. Within this writing piece, we can see a unique perspective on the topics that we have discussed today, especially when it states that prison populations soared during this period, enabling the state to play a critical role in mediating the brutal terms of negotiation between capitalism and the spectrum of unfree labor. The transition from slave-based agriculture to industrial economies thrust ex-slaves and unskilled laborers into new labor arrangements that left them vulnerable to depressed. The transfer of power to the state, signaled by the 13th Amendment, profoundly reshaped the political landscape along with emancipation. Convict labor became increasingly racialized. It was assumed that blacks were more suitable for hard physical labor on southern prison farms and on corporate railroad and construction company projects. This mimicking of the slave system structure in the post-emancipation prison system, particularly in the South, suggested a belief that the performance of antebellum culture could bring the slave system back to life. And end quote. As you can see, from this perspective, the transition from slave labor to industrial labor for black folks was made entirely complicated by corporations. They were offered no guidance or support in this process. And that is just one of the many constant uphill battles black folks have had to endure throughout history. The government declared them to be free in all aspects during the civil rights era. However, we have learned that they have never truly been freed, and that they have had to continually fight for their freedom every day of their lives. I will never truly know what it is like to live a day in someone else's shoes. However, I will try my best to educate myself and those around me about these systems and help people fight to end these systems of oppression, especially the prison industrial complex. With that being said, I know this might have been all over the place, but I hope you gathered at least something from this podcast episode, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, mulling over the fact that currently 2.2 million people in the U.S. are incarcerated.